Good afternoon, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live interview brought to you by the Human Brain Project. My name is Angelica da Silva Lantyer. I'm the project manager of the Human Brain Project at the CIUS in the UVA. Today, I will be interviewing Cyriel Pennartz, professor and head of the Department of Cognitive and Systems Neuroscience here at the University of Amsterdam. Our discussion will focus on his work in the Human Brain Project, which involves connecting brain-inspired deep learning models to biomimetic robots. I would like to welcome him to join me on screen. Hi, Cyriel.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Fine. Yeah. Sunny day out here in Amsterdam. Yeah, quite unusual.
Yeah, nice, right? So you have worked with your team in a suite of models for visual perception and object recognition. What do you want to address with this research? What is the scientific question that you're trying to answer there?
All right, we start from the very general question of how the human brain works, but you can't study that all at once. So we focus in this case on perception. How do we perceive the world and objects in it? Because perception is fundamental to so much of brain function and also leads us to ask, well, how do we distinguish objects in our environments against the background? How do we come to recognize objects and make memories basically on those percepts? And the way we approach it in the human brain is to make models, computer models of perception. Those models are being simulated and tested using computers, supercomputers. And then the approach following that is actually to test the models, whether they are valid by collecting data on brains, human brains, but also animal brains, and testing whether actually the model helps robots to make sense of the robot world and help them forward to navigate in their world.
Okay, so you take inspiration from biology to prepare these models, and how do you do that? How do you make sense? How do you prepare those models, taking into base biological brains, the inspiration of biological brains?
Right, so we focus on the cortex, which is this large convoluted structure just below the skull. And the cortex is known to contain a lot of areas that have to do with sensation and perception. One is, for instance, the visual cortex, which is sitting all the way at the back of your head. And we look at the structure, the anatomical structure of the cortex, which basically has pathways that run from that primary receptive visual station to higher areas, which are more towards the front, and also backwards in the feedback direction. We're going from high areas back to low areas. And that leads to a kind of architecture that we think is very useful. We mimic that biology in the models and also look at the physiology, that is the kind of electrical processes that take place in the brain, to mimic all that in the models. And while you might know of artificial intelligence models, deep learners, they primarily work with a lot of stacked layers of, let's say, simulated neurons, which pass their messages forward through all these layers. And eventually there's like a category being distinguished, like this picture was about apples or pears. But in the Human Brain Project, we work in a more biological way with so-called generative models. It means that in addition to this feed-forward processing, going from low to high areas, there's also the pass backwards, so that there's, for instance, imagery possible. There's not only a reproduction or categorization of the data, but also basically new percepts can be formed, or you can imagine things. And we can try to mimic the percepts, the sensory inputs, as closely as possible. So that's called a generative model, where you also have a model that generates new percepts potentially. And it's also called inferential. That means, the brain is basically trying to infer what causes its sensory input, like what objects are behind the patterns of light stimulation that fall on the retina. And that style is called predictive coding. So basically the brain is trying to predict or represent the outer world and the body in that.
Right. So if the models are generating their own percepts, how could you explain? Would you say that the models have a sort of cognition? Would they have a sort of consciousness on what's going on?
Well, eventually, yes. Right now, it's difficult to answer. It's still early days, even though we're in the 21st century. But yeah, eventually the consciousness would be some kind of representation, but a very large-scale representation of the environment with our bodies in it, with multiple sensations. And we're not there yet to really simulate that. But we're scaling up in the meantime. Yeah, what I think the models also are lacking is this sort of conceptual understanding of what the sensory inputs mean. So you might be able to have a model, which we already have, that generates kind of artificial percepts in the sense that they generate their own representations from which the images can be derived. But like what all that sensory input means in terms of apples, pears, object meanings is still further station to go.
Okay, so at this level, what the models can do. So could you describe a little bit into the details what the models can do at this moment at this stage?
Right, yeah. So one thing that the models can do is something very basic. So basically you look at a tennis ball and it rolls in front of you on the tennis court. And you sort of have an idea, well, the picture there, the image is changing because the ball is rolling forward. That's kind of the stream of consciousness. But you also recognize it to be the same tennis ball all the time. And, because of your perspective, the shape could change, etc. And the position will change. Now, we built a model that is a PhD student in the group, Matthias Buchlacher, that captures both these aspects. So like specific image recognition and also object recognition, that is the invariant object. So it's kind of tolerating these differences in viewing angles and positions. And that is a big step towards conceptualization of that it is a tennis ball. And then you have to sort of link that to how to play with it, what its physical properties are, like its elasticity, etc. But these are models, and it's always important to test them. Like, is the physiology of the brain actually doing something like that? And then are the models really working so that, for instance, an artificial agent could benefit from it? So do these models bring something for a robot? And that's also something we're testing with Martin Pearson and his group at the University of Bristol, also in the Human Brain Project, because they are having a physical robot called the Whiskeye. And there you can put a model basically into the robot's brain, so to say, and make it navigate, make it act on the basis of those models. So that's really a new and interesting aspect.
Right. How is this physical robot like?
It actually has very much a physical layout like a rodent, basically. So think of a rat or a mouse, perhaps, with whiskers that go back and forth. And this robot really tries to sense the environment. So it might bump against an object and feel with whiskers what this object is like. It will then recoil and try another part of the environment. So it's basically moving around and exploring the environment. And now it's also got eyes or camera eyes by which visual input enters. So it has both visual and tactile modalities. And it's really interesting because now you can say, well, there's this model in its brain, so to say, that predicts both the visual world, but another module predicts the tactile world. And if all runs okay, then these models will connect. They will feel or represent the same thing. Like, I'm touching an object with the whiskers and I see the object, and those two images kind of match. So that means we have a cross-modal predictive coding model, a multimodal one, because you have both visual predictions and tactile predictions. And what we then showed subsequently was that indeed this robot benefits from those kind of representations by being able to localize itself better in the environment. So it's sort of coding its place in the environment, your self-position, and based on that, it can better navigate, like navigate towards a goal, like a reward site where the robot eats electricity, so to say, to power itself up.
Wow, that's really cool. And how is this translatable to humans if you're using this rodent model for now? For
Right,
human
yeah.
perception.
Right, yeah. I would not say directly translatable. Like to scale up to an Android robot would be really requiring a lot of stuff like limbs and arms and different kind of eye movements, facial movements. But you can take it as a starting point to build such a humanoid robot, especially because also humans will, of course, integrate senses. Humans also use, especially the visual sense, but also audition, tactile sense, somatosensory, that's proprioception, like how is my body located in space. Also for vestibular input, like the sense of balance and acceleration. So those are really important faculties which are basic to both rodents and humans. Rodents will have less cognitive capacities in the way of, language, not as far as we know of. Humans do, so they have a vast greater expanse of, let's say, semantics. Semantic memory means the memory and understanding of facts, words, general concepts, etc., what you read in the newspaper, basically. So that's going to be a challenge to go from the senses up to the level of concepts and semantic understanding.
Okay. And now you are part of the Human Brain Project. And how does it help you to make your research go forward? And what is also the access to EBRAINS infrastructure? How does it facilitate this process of making those models and integrating into the robots?
Right, yeah. Well, in the first place, we would and could never have done this research outside the context of the human brain, because a lot of stuff is needed to make it happen. First of all, the bigger network of scientists by which we can actually connect our work in brain physiology and anatomy to the robot work. So the context and the actual realization of the work with the robots, the Whiskeye robot, was facilitated and made possible by the Human Brain Project. But in addition, for the models, you need to simulate them, and that requires a lot of computer power. That is present in EBRAINS, the research infrastructure of the Human Brain Project. The computers allow us to simulate like millions of neurons with even more synapses. Those are the connection between the neurons. And therefore, you also need simulation tools. So let's say basically software environments in which the simulations can be done and accelerated using the supercomputers. So that's a really key service for us. And then our colleagues in Bristol, Martin Pearson, have moved on to use the NRP, that's the neurorobotics platform of EBRAINS, in which there's no physical robot anymore, but basically a virtual robot in a virtual environment. And that allows some acceleration, because then you don't have to deal with all the physical devices of the robot that might get broken, the sensors might fail, which is an interesting exercise, because you do actually see that if the camera eye drops out, then the tactile sense is there to take over from it. And from
that's really cool.
Yeah, you can see how, if the eyes are blinded artificially, then the tactile sense is still able to generate visual predictions. So in other words, the brain is able to tell, well, what the visual world would look like only having the whiskers active, or vice versa. It's something one finds in blind people as well to some extent, that using braille reading, people that have seen before are still able to have imagery. But yeah, so the Neurorobotics platform is an important asset to accelerate the robotic simulations. I mean, you can basically do multiple simulations in parallel. So you can say, well, I have 10 virtual robots that navigate around and try variations of the models, like see which one does better than the other.
And it's really interesting. And can eBRAINS users also interact with this research via the neurorobotics platform, for example, or other research collaborators could like add inputs, new information to integrate with the models that are already existing?
Yeah, users can also log in from external and get an account, get access to the robotic models, try out variations and simulate that. And thus the work can spread and can basically multiply. So I think that would be a great use of eBRAINS, and that's happening already to a certain extent. So yeah, for us, the Human Brain Project is really a greatly accelerating research infrastructure, and we're now also, one effect that you have is that you see how the models and their tests are yielding new predictions for experiments to do.
Wow. So the model are inspiring new research even.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Either in the way of testing the models or improving them and generating further experiments as to how to do this. So that's, I think a key cycle of brain research that you have. You start from an experiment, from an observation that directs modeling, you test the models, and then it goes back to experiments. So it's the slow part is in the experiments probably, but very much worthwhile. And yeah.
But this infrastructure seems to be speeding it up a little bit. not even a little bit, even a lot maybe.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, but also allowing it to happen. So if you join as a neuroscientist, then really the possibilities open up to do so much more interdisciplinary work. So that is at the interface of brain science and artificial intelligence also. Because we hope that models which are in a sense more realistic than the AI, the machine learning that we have, will eventually also provide better tools to improve AI and to make robots more capable of dealing with real world problems. Right.
Okay, so is this one of the goals of the research as well? Because my next question was going to be where do you want to get? So what is your ultimate goal with this research? But also if there would be any impact for patients, for example, in this research for real applications of the models or of the results, I mean.
Yeah. My biggest personal goal with it is actually to really understand the brain better. And this goes certainly slowly, but at least it's being accelerated by these simulations and robotics. From a greater understanding of the brain, we can move in a lot of directions. So I already indicated that it might be possible to improve AI methods, so artificial intelligence, make it more brain-like. That's also, of course, having an ethics aspect of like, when do we actually want to have a conscious robot, or a robot where you might say, well, is it conscious or not? Friendly robots, it's not so much a problem, but killer drones, killer robots, we should be able to turn them off basically without asking too many problems. But there's also certainly a future use in patients, not immediately, but on the longer run, because I think these models can help a great deal with neuroprosthetics. That is neurotechnology that can, for instance, compensate for sensory loss in patients. I think of blind people or hearing impaired. In the long run, you could also think of like memory prosthetics, trying to replace broken brain parts that have to do with memory. And one key problem is basically to say, well, if an area is damaged, for instance, by stroke, how did that area function to enable something like perception? We know that if people, for instance, suffer from a stroke in their right parietal cortex, they suffer from a kind of weird syndrome, hemi-neglect, which means that they can still process sensory inputs, but they don't have an image of their often visual left world that they can attend to. Sometimes also the awareness of the left body parts is lost.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, basically, can we understand that area to start replacing it with electronic parts, with instruments like neuromorphic devices? So they mimic the behavior of neurons, and
Mm-hmm.
we're in other projects also connecting basically recording electrodes. So they pick up sensory activity in the brain, and then we try to translate that activity into motor output. So how would an individual actually convert sensory inputs into actions? Like the patient doesn't see anymore that something is happening in the left field, but by this artificial neuromorphic device, it might be enabled to still to act on that lost sensory part.
Okay.
So that's the idea. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds very promising. I would like to go a little bit on this point of ethics that you just mentioned. So it seems that indeed can be challenging if a robot starts developing its own consciousness, or a machine or a person is also partially with some robotic input, and maybe this person do something that would not do perhaps without this implant, let's say. What are your thoughts on that, and how is the Human Brain Project also involved in dealing with the ethical aspects of this research?
Right. Yeah. So Human Brain Project has a big ethics component. Also
Yeah.
dealing with this dual use aspect, it means that some kind of discovery could have a use in fundamental science and helping to cure people, but could also have a potential military use, for instance, and that's making it dual. So yeah, I think strict ethical boundaries should be drawn. There should also be, I think, rules for saying what kind of devices are we thinking about? Are we allowed to switch off devices? Do we want to allow them to have some kind of consciousness, perhaps, or should we bring ourselves into the position where we start doubting whether they have consciousness? That's also a difficult position in the case of killer drones that might have to be shut down before they commit any crimes when working autonomously. I don't think we're that far yet. I think there's no machine in the world that could claim any sort of consciousness. There was also this Lambda chatbot of Google, where an employee sort of suspected that it could be or should be conscious because it was talking about death and contemplating death. But these are still, well, very clever linguistic machines that have learned about the statistical structure of linguistic items. So death might relate to concepts like loneliness, sadness, feeling down, and
And it's
whatever.
just associating the speech, but it's not actually feeling it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just learn clever tricks about how a word like death relates to other words, and then knows how to connect these words in new sentences to talk about it. But of course, this chatbot never experienced real world things like loneliness or feeling down or sadness, etc. There's no sensory world for these robots to gain experience from. So it's just basically about mathematics and statistics, what is being learned. and that is very little. So it might seem that AI is tremendously advancing towards consciousness, but I don't think so. And that's why we also start at the basis of like, how does the brain do it? And how does the brain even make a seemingly simple percept? That is difficult enough. But even that has ethical aspects. It's totally true. I think once we start building more in neurotechnology directions, prosthetics, you also have to ask, like, what is safe for a patient? Because any sort of brain-machine interface could be susceptible to bringing in false information, for instance, into a patient brain, and thereby manipulating it. So there should always be clear checkups that the goal is purely therapeutic. The patient has some kind of voluntary control about when input enters his or her brain and what kind of input that is. But it could also have a lot of benefits actually for people to have these interfaces. We see the emergence of like cochlear implants are around for a while. Those are devices where hearing impaired people get in their inner ear actually an electrode array that stimulates the cochlea, the inner ear organ for hearing. And so that emits pulses by which the acoustic nerve to the brain is also activated. And then the brain still has to make sense of those signals. But that already works for people. There's also retinal implants for vision. So when the eye is suffering a disease that makes the retina degenerate, then it's already possible to implant chips that will basically turn impinging light input into electrical stimulation patterns on the retina. So those are the first devices to help people. But we see this also moving, let's say, into the brain when the peripheral senses are completely gone or damaged, and then stimulating more the cortex directly. So that's happening at the level of the visual cortex, and we are working on this device for hemineglect, which is even higher up in the processing hierarchy of the cortex.
Yeah. You're working on it in humans already, or?
No. This kind of technology first has to be tested in animal models. Once it's safe and it works there, then the next step could be taken towards humans. But that is taking a while. I mean, we're talking here at least 10 years, probably more like 20 years.
I was going to ask you about the timeline, because you were saying, no, we're not there yet. But then when do you think we would be there, you think?
Well, in a way, there are already devices that have been tested in humans. So this would be the electrical arrays by which to stimulate the visual cortex. That's been tested already tens of years ago, actually, but with small amounts of electrode arrays. And blind people who got this actually reported that they were able to see some things, very coarse resolution, very pixel-like in a way. But through a sort of natural learning process or adaptation, they learned to see, they sort of learned to infer what was behind those pixelated patterns. Like a patient described how he was, only with something like 20 electrodes, was already able to discern a doorpost, so he could pass through the door opening, and was able to visualize, in a way, the face of somebody familiar, like his child or so. So that is already very gratifying. But now things are scaling up. Our colleague Peter Roelsema at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience is working on 1,000 electrode array and even more that is being tested in monkeys, also to move on to humans. So those are important developments. An exciting development is to make the stimulation more specific, and that is done not by electrical stimulation of those patterns onto the brain, but rather by optogenetics. And thereby light is being used to stimulate particular cell types in the brain. So you can more specifically say, well, this area I want more shut down, that area has to turn on, but I only want those and those cells to turn on. So it's becoming
that would be excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the electrical stimulation is a bit of a sledgehammer, but the optogenetics might enable us to do real fine tuning on this. So yeah, there's prospect for the future.
Okay, that sounds really good. Is there anything else that you would like to mention on your research? Anything, because we are now already a little bit over time, but we could still, or you have.
Well, I would encourage people who listen in. If you are in research or in patient organizations or family members with disease, to engage and follow the research, because it's really important that it continues. Even after the official HPP grant is finished, we do want to go on with the research infrastructure and enable more users to benefit from it. It's also kind of important because there are large other initiatives for physics, particle accelerators, which are also very important, like astronomic research. But like the human brain is really appealing to all of us because we have one, and it really can go bad. The process can go awry. There's so many psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia, autism that also need a cure, and there's very little. I mean, traditional pharmacology is really not enough to cure that. So we need new tools and brain investigations to do that. So like schizophrenia also links back, to hallucinations. Those are misrepresentations of our consciousness in a way that make us experience things which aren't really there. So it's all linked in a way, and profoundly. Yeah, I think I'd like to leave it at that, unless you have more questions, Angelica.
No, I think it was a great interview. It was really nice talking to you, and it has been really a great discussion. I hope the people here also enjoyed it. Cyriel.
Well, thank you as well for your very challenging and interesting questions.
Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you, Cyriel. I hope you have a great afternoon here in Amsterdam. And our next LinkedIn Live interview will take place on July 6th at 12 Central European Time. We will feature Mario Senden, Assistant Professor at the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience in the University of Maastricht. He will be discussing how he and his team have trained a robotic hand to perform in-hand object manipulation. We hope to see you then. Thank you for joining me, and I wish you a great afternoon. Bye-bye.